That sultry Sunday, when the sun scorched over the simple rooftops of the outskirts and the heat seeped through the cracks of the windows like a warning of something new, Patrícia arrived early at church. She wore her light blue dress, modest and flowing, with sleeves that covered her shoulders and a white ribbon tied in her long brown hair. She was a vision of purity in that wooden temple, with benches worn by time. She sang in the choir as she did every Sunday, but that day her voice trembled a bit more. There was something in the air, something she herself couldn't name. She felt a restlessness in her chest, as if God were about to do something extraordinary, and he was. Across the city, in a high-end gated community, Wellington stared at himself in the mirror. 35 years old, precisely trimmed beard, dark hair slicked back, and a body sculpted by years of gym and discipline. He was stunning in an almost offensive way. Strong, muscular, attractive, always well-dressed, always desired. He had money, imported cars, fame in business circles, and lists of women willing to do anything for a moment by his side. But that morning was different. He looked at himself and saw nothing, just an empty man. A man surrounded by pleasures that no longer gave him pleasure, as if success had ceased to be a triumph and become a burden. Deep down, he felt he needed peace, and everything he knew until then only brought noise. He dressed with unusual simplicity, dark jeans, a white cotton shirt with sleeves rolled up to the elbows, and a simple watch. He grabbed his car keys and said to himself, "Today, I will look for God." He drove aimlessly through streets he didn't know, as if an invisible force guided his way. He passed busy avenues, intersections with broken traffic lights, until he saw a small wooden sign, Assembly of God, Hope Ministry. He parked, got out of the car, as if stepping onto sacred ground, without knowing why. And when he opened the church door, the fresh air from the simple ventilation hit his face like a heavenly breeze. All eyes turned to him. After all, it was uncommon for a man like him, so worldly, to show up in a humble temple like that, but he didn't notice the stares. His eyes were fixed on something, or rather, someone. Patrícia. She stood at the pulpit, singing with her eyes closed, hands raised, and a tear trailing down her cheek. Her face was as gentle as a prayer. Her honey-colored skin seemed to glow under the improvised ceiling light. And her voice touched something in Wellington that no woman had ever reached. Not with her body, not with words. It was as if each note from that poor girl opened wounds he didn't even know he had. He sat in the last pew, not to draw attention, but because from there he could see her better. And right there, he felt it. Something he had never felt in any hotel penthouse, in any stolen kiss, in any 1,000-thread count sheet. He felt that this girl was the answer to a question he had never dared to ask. Patrícia opened her eyes and saw him. At first, she was unsettled. A man like that in a place like this. Her heart raced. He was too handsome, too manly, too intense. And even though she had never seen him before, she felt a calling that frightened her. A calling from her soul, but confused with the body. She finished the hymn and stepped down from the pulpit with hurried steps, trying not to look again. But she did, and he was still watching her. Not with lust, not with desire, but with something she couldn't translate. Something between fascination and reverence. During the sermon, Wellington never took his eyes off her, and Patrícia, seated beside the other young women of the church, looked away, pretended to listen to the pastor, but her heart pounded too loudly for her to understand any word. And so, without exchanging a single phrase, something had already begun. An inexplicable, almost forbidden bond. She was a virgin, raised to serve God, daughter of strict parents, used to simplicity. He was rich, experienced, marked by sins and scars from a world she had never even imagined touching. And yet, there was something there that even heaven could not ignore. When the service ended, he approached slowly, discreetly removing his cap as a sign of respect. The church members looked at him with suspicion. Some older women murmured. The pastor watched cautiously, but Patrícia stood paralyzed. He reached out his hand, and she, hesitant, touched that firm, warm, powerful palm. "My name is Wellington," he said, his voice deep and low. She replied almost in a whisper, "Patrícia, And at that moment, without kisses, without promises, without any declared intentions, their fate was sealed. That first gaze was deeper than any physical contact, more intense than any carnal desire. It was the beginning of a journey where faith would be tested, pride challenged, and love, that improbable love between the repentant dominator and the fearful virgin, would become the living proof that God writes straight with crooked lines. Wellington's presence in that modest temple did not go unnoticed by anyone. In that small and close-knit community, where every new visitor was welcomed with pats on the back and spontaneous prayers, the arrival of a man so far from their norm, with his broad shoulders, striking features, and woody cologne that seemed to reach even the back pews, had an almost supernatural impact. In the church hallways, prayer groups, and even the children's room, the whispers grew louder. "Did you see that new man? He looks like a soap opera star. Is he here to convert or just curious?" And amid all the murmurs and speculation, Patrícia listened in silence, trying to pretend she wasn't deeply shaken. But her heart did not lie. Every time she remembered Wellington's eyes fixed on hers, she felt a dizziness that wasn't from the spirit. It was something much more earthly, human, and dangerous. Meanwhile, Wellington drove home that night with a mind ablaze. The service had ended, but he felt that something had only just begun. He had never been a man to be easily impressed. He had known women from all over the world, lain with models, dancers, executives, but none of them had ever made him feel the mixture of respect and desire that now consumed him. Patrícia was not like the others. She had something he had lost, or maybe never had: light, purity, a kind of beauty that didn't show itself off, but burned from within. And for the first time in his life, Wellington desired someone, without wanting to possess her. He just wanted to be near, to hear her voice, to sit beside her, to share a verse. That scared him, and at the same time, pulled him like a current. The next morning, the news spread quickly. The elder sisters in the church spoke among themselves as if they had witnessed a miracle. "Did you see the size of that man? And the car? A black Audi, tinted windows. God is bringing in the lost, sister, even the great ones." Others, more skeptical, warned it might be a trap. "The devil also disguises himself as an angel of light," warned Sister Zuleika, one of the congregation's elders. Meanwhile, the single girls of the church didn't even try to hide their interest. They spoke in hints, exaggerated their smiles when he passed by, fixed their hair, and invented excuses to get close. But he only had eyes for Patrícia. On Wednesday, during the teaching service, Wellington returned. He sat in the same front pew, a brand new Bible in his hands. His gaze was serious, focused, like a student eager to understand everything. During the sermon, he took notes, read the references the pastor cited, and at the end, waited quietly for the final blessing. It was impossible to ignore him. And Patrícia, though trying to keep her eyes on the floor, felt her whole body react every time he moved. When he stood, it was as if the air around him changed, and when he walked nearby, the entire world seemed to slow down. That night, after the service, the pastor called him for a conversation. They sat on a wooden bench at the back of the temple. Wellington spoke little, but enough to show he wasn't just a curious visitor. He said he wanted to change, that he was tired of a life without purpose, that he had lived everything, but now he wanted to live for God. The pastor, though cautious, sensed sincerity. It was hard to read what lay behind those penetrating eyes, but there was something broken in that man who seemed so whole on the outside, something that made him, in a way, familiar, like someone God himself was shaping. The following week, Wellington appeared at a youth service. He was the only man over 30 there. Some found it strange, others silently criticized, but Patrícia noticed. She noticed he was fighting to belong, to understand, to fit into this new world. And even without saying a word, she began to pray for him. At home, at night, she knelt and prayed, "Lord, if this man is your work, give me wisdom, but if he's a trap, take him away from me." She was sincere, she was afraid, but she had faith. Meanwhile, the rumors grew louder. Some church members discovered who Wellington really was: a renowned businessman, property owner, former partner in a nightclub, millionaire. The news hit the congregation like a bomb. The women were stirred. The men grew tense. Patricia's mother went on high alert. That kind of man doesn't come to church to find God. He comes to hunt innocent girls, she said harshly. And Patrícia, with a heart torn in two, began to feel the weight of judgment before even knowing whether there was a real path between her and that man. But Wellington kept coming, Sunday after Sunday, silent, intense, committed. The pastor invited him to join the discipleship class. He accepted, began attending Bible studies, asked questions, read the Gospels at home, and in everything he did, he watched Patrícia from afar, with respect, with admiration, with something new, something that neither he, nor she, nor anyone in that church could precisely define. But that was growing like an invisible root of a tree no one could yet see, but that, sooner or later, would bear fruit. And so, the church split between those who saw Wellington as a threat and those who began to believe that maybe, just maybe, he truly was a miracle. The wind blew gently that Sunday morning, lightly swaying the simple church curtains, as if even heaven wanted to witness what was about to unfold. Patrícia arrived early, as always, Bible in hand and mind in turmoil. She had prayed the entire week, fasted in secret, asking God to speak clearly to her about the man who had invaded her thoughts. She didn't want to lose herself. She didn't want to fall into temptation, but she could no longer deny it. Wellington was inside her, in her heart, her mind, her dreams, and it was a kind of feeling she had never experienced. It wasn't infatuation. It was something deeper, something that involved soul, faith, and danger. Wellington arrived early as well. He dressed simply, yet still stood out like a lion among lambs. Light shirt with sleeves rolled up, black pants, and a leather bracelet on his wrist. The subtle cologne, the firm stride, the calm gaze. He seemed like a different man. He had left the luxury cars at home. He came on foot, on purpose. He wanted to empty himself. He wanted to be truly present. And that day, something was pushing him. He felt the Spirit was preparing a moment that would change everything. After the service, as the church members chatted and discussed the pastor's sermon, Patrícia went to put away the microphone in the small side room of the temple. She was alone, organizing the cables, when she heard the door creak softly. She turned slowly, and he was there, Wellington, leaning against the doorframe, eyes fixed on her, yet not intrusive, as if asking for permission with just his gaze. She stood still for a moment, then took a deep breath and smiled, though her heart felt like it was about to burst. "Can I help you with that?" he asked, nodding toward the equipment. His voice was deep but soft, respectful. Patrícia hesitated. She wanted to say no. She wanted him to leave. But above all, she wanted to hear him speak. "I'm almost done, but thank you," she replied. He took a step forward, no more. "Sorry if I'm being intrusive. I just wanted to say thank you. Your voice today, it touched something I didn't even know existed in me." That felt like an internal earthquake. Patrícia lowered her eyes, her cheeks burning. "The one who touches is the Holy Spirit, not me," she answered humbly. He smiled, a light, sincere smile that tore down any barrier. Wellington stepped a bit closer, still respecting the distance. He pulled a Bible from the side pocket of his pants. "I've been reading a lot, but there are things I don't understand." She looked at him, surprised. "Like what?" she asked. He opened the Bible to John, chapter 3. "When Jesus talks about being born again, is that symbolic or literal?" Patrícia came closer, opened her own Bible, and read the verse aloud. Her voice trembled, but it was firm. "It's about leaving your old life, you know. It's like dying to the world and being born to God, with a new vision, a new soul." And then, for the first time, their eyes met up close. No audience, no whispers, just the two of them, God, and the silent fire being lit right there. Wellington listened intently, but there was something in his eyes, something between curiosity and desire, not lust, a different hunger, a hunger for truth, for presence, for pure love. And Patrícia felt it. She felt deep in her bones that this man wasn't there just for words. He wanted to find God, but he wanted to find him with her. as if she were the bridge, as if her faith were the lamp that illuminated his path. And that was beautiful, but also dangerous. Their conversation lasted over 20 minutes. They explored verses, talked about faith, about change, about the world. Several times Patrícia tried to end the dialogue, to flee, to protect herself, but something greater kept her there. And Wellington, always respectful, never crossed a line. He listened intently, as if learning from every word, and in the end, when the room was nearly empty, he said something that made her freeze. "Patrícia, I know I'm everything you were taught to avoid. I know my past, but I want to tell you something. I didn't come looking for any woman. I came looking for God, and along the way, I found you." She didn't answer. There were no words, only tears in her eyes. He didn't move closer. He simply smiled, thanked her for the conversation, and walked out of the room with calm steps. And Patrícia, alone there, holding her Bible to her chest, fell to her knees on the floor. She cried like never before, not from fear, not from pain, but because she knew in that moment that her life would never be the same. From that day forward, their conversations became frequent, always discreet, always respectful, but increasingly deep. The church began to notice. Patrícia's mother began to grow suspicious, and the two of them were already trapped in a web larger than themselves. A web written by invisible hands, where verses mingled with desire, where sin lurked in the corners of the soul, and where love bloomed between the pages of faith. The name Wellington was synonymous with power, presence, and conquest. In the city's business circles, he was remembered as a genius, a real estate shark, a born negotiator who turned dust into gold. In the elite's nightlife circles, he was known as a man of expensive tastes, attractive to the point of seeming sculpted by hand, desired by women who knew exactly what he offered and what he would never give: commitment. Wellington had always had the world at his feet, but he had never known peace. And when he started attending church, when he heard the worship and felt the warmth of that simple community, he knew he could no longer run from the hardest confrontation of all, the confrontation with his own past. That silent night, after the conversation with Patrícia, he opened a bottle of wine and left it on the table. He stared at the dark liquid, like blood, and thought about everything he had done, everything he hid behind the flawless facade, the sculpted body, the confident gaze. He remembered the luxury apartments where he hosted endless parties, the women he used like cigarettes: light, consume, discard. He remembered the betrayals, the contracts signed with lies, the nights he lay beside warm bodies and woke up with a frozen soul. He remembered the day he lost his brother to drugs and didn't shed a single tear, the night his mother died and he chose to finish a business meeting before going to the hospital. Above all, he remembered the pride that had always guided him, the pride that insisted on never loving, never getting attached, never asking for forgiveness. And now, there, faced with the image of that pure face looking at him with sweetness and fear, all of it seemed rotten, small, filthy. Wellington began fasting. No one knew, not even Patrícia. He traded parties for church services, social events for Bible studies, began isolating from old friends, unfollowed models on social media, cancelled a trip to Dubai, all because something inside him screamed. Something said, either you cleanse yourself or you'll lose her. And losing Patrícia was more than losing a woman. It was losing the only chance to find himself again. It was as if God had placed in her the key to his restoration. But to hold that key, he would have to give up everything. The temptations didn't stop. Models called, ex-lovers showed up at his door, childhood friends invited him for one last party. "Are you sick?" they laughed. "Turned religious now?" But he resisted, in silence, in fasting, in prayer. He began going to Wednesday services and sitting in the middle pew to avoid attention. Arrived early, helped carry chairs, sweep the yard, hand out flyers, and Patrícia watched, from afar, without knowing the weight he carried, without imagining that, inside, he was bleeding, because every change came with pain, and every renunciation felt like it cut into the flesh of the old Wellington. In one of the discipleship classes, the pastor spoke about repentance, said it wasn't just saying, "Forgive me," but turning your back on everything that once gave you pleasure. And Wellington felt his soul tremble. That night, he went to the empty church, alone, knelt before the altar, even without fully understanding the rituals, and cried, like a child, cried for everything he had been, for everything he had destroyed, for all the bodies he had used, for all the feelings he had ignored. And he said out loud, forehead pressed to the floor, "Lord, I'm not worthy of her, nor of you, but if there's still mercy, transform me." The next day, his image consulting team called urgently. A blogger had published a headline, "Millionaire tycoon spotted in neighborhood church. Rumored involvement with virgin girl from congregation." The photo was clear. Him leaving the church, Patrícia in the background. The story went viral among business people. Emails circulated. Phone calls poured in. He lost a sponsor, became the target of mockery, but he didn't react, didn't delete anything, didn't sue. He simply remained silent. And deep inside, he felt relief, as if the scandal had been the final push he needed to break free from who he once was. Meanwhile, Patrícia began hearing rumors. Church sisters asked if there was something between her and the new convert. Her mother searched her Bible for hidden notes. Her father said nothing, but watched her schedule closely. And she, having done nothing wrong, felt the weight of the world on her shoulders. Because loving Wellington wasn't just an emotional risk, it was a spiritual scandal. And still, even afraid, she prayed. And inside her soul, she felt God whisper, "Trust, I'm writing this story." And so, while the world mocked, while appearances faded and prejudice spread like poison, Wellington faced the greatest enemy of all, himself. And Patrícia fought not to lose herself in the most dangerous love of her life. Patrícia's house was simple, but full of rules. One of those rules was as clear as the Bible verses taped to the refrigerator. You don't mix the holy with the profane. Since childhood, she had heard from her parents that men like Wellington, too handsome, too rich, too intense, were sent by the enemy to lead God's daughters astray. And even though she had never said a word about what she felt, the change in her behavior started to reveal everything. Her distracted gaze, her shy smile after church services, the way she clutched her Bible to her chest when returning home. Her mother, Donna Cicera, a firm, devout woman with watchful eyes and strict prayers, was the first to notice. Her father, Señor José, more silent but even more rigid, watched it all with a furrowed brow. And on a rainy afternoon, the confrontation happened. They were at the table. Lunch was getting cold. The tension was a scream no one dared to release, until her mother set down her fork and said bluntly, "You've been looking at that man too much, Patrícia." The young woman swallowed hard, tried to deny it. "He only talks to me about the Bible, Mum." But the reply came like thunder. "Don't quote scripture to me. The devil knows the word too. Do you think I don't see the way he looks at you? That's not a man of God's gaze." Her father crossed his arms. "That's right, Patrícia. That kind of man only wants one thing, and when he gets it, he'll toss you away like he did with the others." Those words cut like a blade. Patrícia wanted to scream that Wellington had changed, that he was seeking God, that he had never touched her with disrespect. But even she didn't know how to explain, how to prove it. After all, even she carried doubts inside. She loved God above all else, but she also loved that man without understanding why. And in that crossfire between faith and desire, between authority and freedom, she felt the ground crumbling beneath her feet. "You're being unfair," she cried, voice trembling. "He's not who you think he is. He's changed." Her mother stood up, furious. "Changed? Nothing. Men like him don't change. They just change their mask." In the days that followed, the watch tightened. Patrícia was no longer allowed to go to church alone. Her mother went with her, sat beside her, watching with eagle eyes. She was forbidden from speaking with Wellington. Her phone was checked every night. The atmosphere at home became a cold war. And Patrícia began to fade. She fasted in silence, cried into her pillow, felt like a prisoner under judgment she never asked for. And worst of all, she knew Wellington was suffering too, because he had stopped coming close, not from lack of interest, but out of respect. He understood that their love was now surrounded by high walls, walls built from fear, from past wounds, from religion. But the feeling didn't fade. On the contrary, it grew in the absence. like a flower blooming through stone. And one day, after a service, as the church emptied, Wellington saw her from afar, cleaning the pulpit. He approached slowly, careful not to intrude. "Just wanted to know if you're okay," he whispered. Patrícia glanced around. Her mother was distracted in the hallway. "I'm not," she replied, tears in her eyes. "But I'm still praying." He nodded, eyes misty. "Me too." That night, Wellington wrote a letter, a long, sincere letter full of confessions. He spoke of his past, his pain, what he felt for her. There were no promises, only surrender. He gave the letter to the pastor, asked that it be read by Patrícia's parents. The pastor hesitated but agreed. It was time to put everything before God and before man. When her parents received the letter, they remained silent. Her father read it in a low voice. Her mother sat with arms crossed. Wellington's words carried weight, but weight was not enough. Judgment still outweighed faith. The next Sunday, Wellington didn't appear. Patrícia waited, anxious, but he didn't walk through the church doors, didn't sit in the front pew, and his absence hurt more than his presence, because prejudice had won, for now. And while she sang at the altar, voice cracking, she felt in her chest the seed of a love that could not die. Because even under the weight of rejection, suspicion, and the rigidity of a conservative home, she knew, deep down, she knew, that God was testing the most genuine thing between them, the faith that stands firm when the whole world says no. Patrícia's house was simple, but governed by unbreakable laws, where the fear of God blurred with fear of the world. Raised among hymns, home worship services, and the rigidity of Christian discipline, Patrícia had never even dared to speak of love. Her feelings were monitored, her thoughts policed, and her body, virgin, untouched, kept as a temple, was her mother, Dona Cícera's pride, and her father, Señor José's silent trophy, a man of few words and many commandments. In that home, any affection needed both divine and parental approval, and Wellington was the opposite of what that house would ever accept. The problem is that love doesn't ask for permission. It enters, settles in, and silently starts changing everything. Ever since Wellington approached with clear eyes and a broken voice, Patrícia had been living in an internal war. By day, she prayed for strength to resist. By night, she dreamed of him walking into church in a suit, holding her hand. And even though she tried to hide it, something inside her had changed. The sparkle in her eyes, the extra time in front of the mirror, the silence at dinner, everything gave it away. Until one cloudy afternoon, during a wordless meal, her mother dropped her knife onto the plate and firmly said, "You've been looking at that man too much, Patrícia." The silence that followed was deafening. She tried to deny it, but her mother didn't leave room. "Don't quote scripture to me. The devil knows the word too. And sometimes he's handsome, smells good, and knows how to smile." Those words felt like slaps to the soul. Patrícia's face burned. Her father lifted his eyes for the first time and declared, without raising his voice, that Wellington is not from God, and I don't want my daughter tangled up with someone who lives in luxury and sin. The phrase hung in the air like a divine sentence. Patrícia wanted to explain, wanted to say that he was changing, that he wasn't the man from the parties anymore, that he now read the Bible, fasted, knelt alone in an empty church. But she couldn't, because even she didn't know if it was all true, or just hope. The days that followed were even harder. Her mother began watching her every move, forbade her from replying to any message that wasn't from family, ordered her to delete her social media. "You are a princess of the Lord. You will not be dragged down by the first pretty face that shows up here pretending to be repentant." Patrícia cried alone in her room, hugged her pillow like it was the embrace she no longer received, and she prayed, repeated the same words every night. "Lord, if this love isn't your will, take it from me. But if it is, give me courage." At church, the pressure increased too. Some of the young women began to distance themselves from her. Others spoke behind her back. Virgin or not, her mind is already contaminated. Even the choir, once her refuge, became an uncomfortable place. She felt the stares, heard the whispers. The pastor still treated her with respect, but even he had grown colder. Patrícia was alone, between God's voice, the world's voice, and her own heart's voice, and none of those voices felt unanimous. Wellington, meanwhile, found out about the family's resistance. One of the sisters from church warned him, "They're saying you want to deceive Señor José's daughter. They want her to change congregations." And that tore him apart. He had never felt rejected before, had never needed to prove anything to anyone. But now, he wanted to prove himself, wanted to show that his love wasn't lust, that his presence there wasn't a trap, that he, the man who once had everything, was now willing to lose it all, just to be worthy of standing beside Patrícia. He tried to reach out, wrote a letter. His handwriting was steady, but his words were humble. He gave it to the pastor, asked that it be passed on to her family. In the letter, he said he respected her parents, that he had never touched their daughter, that he would never dare to dishonor her, that he was changing, that he wanted to be worthy, and asked only for a chance. Not for dating, but to keep learning. The response came 2 weeks later. A dry note, handwritten by her father. "We want no contact. Respect our home." It was a blow. Patrícia learned about the letter, but not the content. She learned about the answer, but not the pain. And she cried without comfort, because she loved her parents, but she was also beginning to love Wellington, and never imagined that love could become sin. That night, for the first time, she left home without telling anyone, went alone to the church, walked into the dark nave, knelt before the empty altar, and said quietly, "Lord, I don't want to disobey my parents, but I also don't want to suffocate who I am. If this man is part of your plan, then change everything, because I don't know what to do anymore." And on the other side of the city, unaware of her prayer, Wellington stared at the ceiling of his room and said the same words, because even though they had been rejected by everyone, their hearts still beat in the same rhythm. And that wasn't coincidence. It was a calling. There was something fierce in Wellington, something that, even after his spiritual surrender, still burned under his skin. It was instinct, dominance, desire. For years he had been used to being master of himself and of others. The touch of his hands had always carried the strength of a magnet. His body, sculpted in muscle and vanity, knew the path of every seduction. That's why, when he fell in love with Patrícia, his greatest battle wasn't against the world, it was against himself. Because loving a virgin woman, humble and God-fearing, required more than patience. It required renunciation, and he had never renounced anything, until now. Since the letter was rejected by her parents, Wellington decided to keep physical distance, but not emotional. He continued attending church services, sat far away, but listened to every note she sang, watched her every move, noticed when she changed the color of the ribbon in her hair, knew when her eyes were swollen from crying. And she saw too, felt it. She knew he was at war, knew that man, who once had it all, was now fighting his own demons to honor her. And that touched her more than any poem or declaration. One day, after a youth service, a situation broke the silence between them. Patrícia's mother had fallen ill and left church early. Patrícia, without transportation, stayed behind to help with the tasks. She stood alone on the sidewalk, waiting for the pastor to lock the gate. Wellington approached cautiously. "Can I give you a ride home?" he asked. She hesitated, looked around. No one was there. "I promise. I just want to take you home. You don't need to be afraid of me." And there was something in his tone that felt more sacred than sinful. She agreed. The car was simple, without show. The dark road heightened the tension. Patrícia kept her hands folded over her skirt, trying to control her breath. Wellington, meanwhile, kept his eyes on the road. But the struggle was intense. Her scent, soft like a flower, filled the space. And her body, though fully covered, awakened in him a kind of desire he had never felt so deeply. Pure desire. Desire that wasn't vulgar, but profound. The desire to love truly, without hurry, without possession. When he stopped in front of her house, they sat in silence for eternal seconds. She was about to open the door when he asked, "Do you think I'm dangerous for you?" The question disarmed her. She looked into his eyes and answered, voice firm, though trembling inside, "I think you're my greatest test." Wellington leaned his head against the steering wheel, sighed. "I've never desired a woman the way I desire you, and never been so afraid to touch someone." She stepped out of the car. Before entering the house, she turned and said, "Then don't touch, because if you touch me, you'll lose me," and closed the door. That night, Wellington didn't sleep. He broke out in cold sweat, recalled every body he had ever held. None of them destroyed him like her absence did now, because what drove him mad wasn't what he could have, it was what he knew he couldn't. He spent the night reading Proverbs, looking up verses about self-control. He cried. Praying, he shouted to God, "Why do you give me a love I cannot touch?" In the days that followed, he kept his distance, but the desire kept growing. Patrícia's purity was a cruel mirror. It reflected the filth he still carried and the greatness he needed to become. She, even as her body trembled whenever he came near, kept her head held high. It wasn't arrogance, it was fear of God. She knew that any slip would be used against her, that the whole world wanted her to fall, and for that reason, she prayed more, fasted, asked God to guard her body, but above all, her mind. Then came the moment no one expected. The food drive organized by Wellington, now a converted man. He bought hundreds of food baskets and asked the church for permission to distribute them throughout the neighborhood. It was his way of serving. Patrícia volunteered to help, and for the first time, they spent the day together, went door to door, laughed, prayed for strangers, watched children playing in the street. For a few hours, they were just two servants at work, but as the sun began to set, something shifted. They stopped in an open field next to an abandoned school. They were alone. Patrícia wiped her hands with a wet cloth. Wellington looked at her as if waiting to see an angel descend from heaven. "You're beautiful," he said. She lowered her gaze. "Don't say that." He stepped closer, then closer still, close enough to feel the warmth of her skin, but he didn't touch her. "Let me just look." She nodded. For a few seconds, they stood there, motionless. He, burning inside. She, trembling like a leaf. And then he closed his eyes, stepped back. "I need to go." And he left. No kiss, no touch, because to love was to respect. That night, Patrícia cried, lying on the floor of her room. But it wasn't sadness. It was something she didn't know how to name. It was the sweet pain of knowing that a man like Wellington had chosen to honor her. And that was greater than any pleasure. When Wellington decided to break from his past, he had no idea that hell itself would move to bring him back. His withdrawal from worldly life did not go unnoticed by those who profited from it. Nightclubs began to feel his absence. Parties became emptier. The women who once surrounded him, accustomed to luxury and easy pleasure, started asking what had happened. Some said he had lost his mind. Others said he was sick. But the truth began to spread in louder whispers. Wellington was attending church. He was reading the Bible. He was in love with a virgin. And the world does not forgive redemption. It began with messages, ex-girlfriends, models, influencers. Some used the past as a weapon. "Did you forget who you were with me?" wrote one. "You really think that girl will understand you like I did?" teased another. Then came the invitations, exclusive parties, dinners in penthouses, discreet club nights with limited guest lists, all with one goal: to make Wellington fall, to test his loyalty to the new path, to reignite the flame of the dominant man who once had the world at his feet. But Wellington resisted, deleted the messages without reading, declined every invite, changed his phone number, replaced his team of advisors, fired his driver. He wanted to cut it all. Until one day, a figure from the past appeared in the flesh. Her name was Sabrina, former international model, sculpted body, feline gaze, a woman who had shared more than sheets with him. They had shared vices, intense nights, even business deals. She knew his weaknesses, knew his cologne, knew how to provoke, and she showed up at church. It was a Sunday service. Patrícia was at the altar, singing. When she saw the woman enter, her heart stopped. The woman wore a tight dress, high heels, heavy makeup. She walked past the congregants with a smug smile and sat next to Wellington, as if it were her right. He froze, looked to the side in disbelief. "What are you doing here?" he whispered. "Came to remind you who you are," she said, running her nail along his arm. "I'm not that man anymore," he replied, and stood up, left in the middle of the service, sweating cold. Patrícia saw it, and even without understanding, she felt the sting of rejection. The next day, gossip spread quickly. He left with a worldly woman. I saw her touching him. Poor Patrícia. And Patrícia broke down, felt small, ugly, useless. How could she compete with women like that? How could she believe that man truly wanted a simple girl, with no experiences, no sculpted curves, no flashy past? She locked herself in her room, fasted, cried, didn't answer messages. Her mother, not knowing the reason, sensed her sorrow and by instinct, prayed with her. For the first time in months, her mother didn't judge. She just embraced her, and that was healing. Wellington, on his part, couldn't bear the pain. He sought the pastor, told him everything, asked for help. She came there to break me, and almost did, but I didn't give in. I left, because I love Patrícia. I love her like I've never loved anything. The pastor listened in silence, then responded firmly, then fight, not just for her, but for you, for your salvation. And he fought, started going to church every day, even when there was no service, helped with cleaning, arranging the pews, read the Bible aloud, alone, and every night he knelt and said the same prayer. Lord, I want to be clean. Even if she never comes back, cleanse me. 2 weeks later, Patrícia showed up. She arrived early, sat in the back pew. The service hadn't even started. Wellington was up front, kneeling. When he turned and saw her, he froze. She looked at him with teary eyes. He approached, but stopped 2 steps away. I didn't touch her, he said. I swear to God, but she touched me, and that made me realize how weak I still am. Patrícia smiled sadly. It's not about weakness, Wellington. It's about choice. Do you still choose me? He dropped to his knees. I choose you, even without your touch, even without your kiss. I choose you with what I have and with what I'm still not. And she replied softly, then get up, because I still pray for you. And there, even without touching, they sealed a pact greater than any physical contact. Because to love is to endure, even when the past screams louder than the present. There was a silent exhaustion growing inside Patrícia, an invisible weariness that not even kneeling on the floor could relieve. Since Wellington had entered her life, she hadn't known peace. Her soul, which once found refuge in simple prayer and the routine of church, was now invaded by doubts, judgments, and gazes that pierced deeper than words. Being the target of gossip, hearing whispers even inside the house of God, feeling the rigidity of her parents like bars around her heart, all of it was draining her faith. But what consumed her the most was loving someone she couldn't have freely. Loving Wellington was like breathing underwater, possible for a few seconds, but unsustainable for long. She was drowning, and no one saw it. After the episode with Sabrina, Patrícia tried to move on, tried to ignore the voice of insecurity, tried to believe in Wellington's change, tried to hear only God's voice. But doubt was a constant worm. Could he truly remain steadfast? Was she really enough? Had God written that love story? Or was it a trap from the devil disguised as romance? And amid these unanswered questions, silence turned to pain, until she made a decision. It was Saturday morning when Patrícia packed her bag. A few clothes, her Bible, a prayer journal, and nothing else. She left a note for her mother. I need to hear God in silence. I'm going to Aunt Raquel's. Forgive me. She didn't call Wellington, didn't text. She just went, took the bus to the countryside, where her aunt lived on a secluded farm. No internet, no neighbors, with a small chapel in the yard. There, she hoped to find answers, or peace, or forgetfulness. Wellington found out on Sunday. He arrived at church, sat as usual, but the pew where she used to sing was empty. He asked the sisters, heard the whispers. She left. They say she ran away. His world collapsed. He left the service before it ended, drove aimlessly through the streets, called the pastor, then friends close to the family. No one knew her exact whereabouts, just that she had gone to rest. But how does one rest with a love suspended between heaven and earth? At the farm, Patrícia woke with the sound of birds and slept with the chirping of crickets. She read psalms aloud, watered plants, helped her aunt cook. But inside, it was desert. Every verse she read seemed to point to contradiction. Be still and know that I am God, said one. But how to still a heart that beats for someone? How to know what is from God, when love itself feels like a minefield? Every night she prayed and cried in silence, Lord, if it's your will, make him forget me. But if it's your plan, show me. And it was during one of those nights that the answer came, not as an audible voice, but as divine intuition. As she prayed, she remembered Wellington's face, kneeling at the altar, saying, I choose you with what I have and what I'm still not. That returned like an echo, and she understood. He wasn't ready, but he was trying. And true love doesn't wait for the other to be ready. Love gives itself even without guarantees. Meanwhile, Wellington began attending church every day, even without services, helped clean the pews, did maintenance, cared for the plants, fasted 3 times a week. Every night he prayed aloud, not knowing if anyone was listening. The pastor began to watch him with new eyes. Even the elder brothers acknowledged the change. A man who once lived for vanity and flesh was now humility and prayer. When Patrícia returned, a month later, she was different, thinner, more serious, but with peace in her eyes. She arrived during a communion service, entered in the middle of the sermon, and when Wellington saw her, he didn't move a muscle. He just bowed his head and cried. She sat beside her mother. At the end, she sought out the pastor, asked to talk. The two entered the room beside the altar. I want to continue my purpose, but I need time, and I need him to prove, not to me, but to God, that he loves him more than he loves me. The pastor nodded, and that night, Wellington understood. The love he wanted wasn't about touch or haste. It was about building. And now, it was time to lay one brick at a time. Wellington had always been a man driven by force. Since youth, he had grown used to winning through the power of presence, through his command of space, through the superiority of his arguments and the intensity of his body. He had never had to lower his head. He had never had to ask twice. If something didn't belong to him, all he had to do was reach out, and the world handed it over. But love for Patrícia wasn't a territory to be conquered through possession. It was a sacred place that could only be reached through surrender. And when he understood that, his life changed completely. The man who once ran companies and appeared in social columns as the embodiment of masculine success now knelt in silence before a wooden altar, asking God for strength to learn how to become a servant. His decision to change was not a fleeting emotion. It was a deep plunge into a process of self-emptying. Wellington began attending church every day, even without services. He cleaned the pews, swept the courtyard, helped distribute pamphlets. He fasted in secret 3 times a week. On Sundays, he arrived early and sat in the back rows, trying not to draw attention. He read the Bible with hunger, studied the gospel like a man who had found the only map to his own salvation. His appearance remained striking, but his pride had vanished. His once piercing gaze had become gentle. His powerful stride had turned reverent. The expensive clothes gave way to simple garments. The gold watch disappeared from his wrist. And more than anything, he began to speak less and listen more. Gradually, the church noticed. Those who once looked at him with suspicion began to observe him with respect. The pastor, once hesitant, started to include him in study groups. One day, he asked Wellington to lead a prayer in the youth circle. His voice trembled. Lord, I'm not even worthy to be here, but if you want to use me, I'm yours. The words weren't rehearsed. They were raw. Many cried. Patrícia was there in the back, with her eyes closed and her heart beating like a drum, not from longing, but from confirmation. She now saw that his change wasn't for her, it was for God. The process, however, wasn't without pain. Behind the transformation, Wellington fought fierce battles. The temptations didn't stop. Models from the past kept showing up. Investors demanded his presence at parties and meetings. An old friend confronted him. So you've turned religious now? Gonna give all this up for some church girl? And Wellington replied with a serene smile. Giving all this up was the best deal of my life. He cancelled contracts, sold shares in nightlife ventures, silently invested his money into social projects, donated without publicity, served without being seen. Each renunciation was a brick in rebuilding the new man. At home, he created an altar, an entire room with a chair, an open Bible, a rug, and a simple wooden cross. There, every day at 3 a.m., he would kneel to pray. He cried. He pleaded. He asked God to cleanse his memories, to heal his wounds, to silence the voices of the past. And slowly he began to hear another voice, a gentle voice, one that didn't accuse but shaped, the voice of God. Patrícia, following the pastor's guidance, kept her distance. She watched everything from afar, observed but didn't get involved. Her faith was also being tested. She was learning to wait, to discern, to trust God's timing. She began singing with more anointing. Her prayers became deeper, and every time she saw Wellington sitting among the brothers, his head bowed, she felt something blossom. It was no longer the wild fire from the beginning. It was peace. It was relief. It was certainty. Love was being purified in the fire of waiting. A month later, during a youth vigil, the pastor opened the floor for spontaneous testimonies. Wellington stood up. Silence fell. Everyone wanted to hear. I was the most prideful man I knew. I lived in excess. I destroyed lives, used people, drowned in pleasures. But one day, I walked through that door and saw something I had never seen before. A light. That light is called Patrícia. But she didn't save me. She pointed me to the Savior. And as he said that, his eyes filled with tears. The pastor walked up to him and embraced him. The congregation stood. That moment wasn't a performance, it was a rebirth. From that moment on, something changed forever. The old Wellington had died. The new Wellington was no longer dominant. He was dominated by the Spirit. And now, finally, he was ready to love truly, without haste, without pride, without demands. Patrícia's heart, though young, had already endured pains many grown women would never face. Being a virgin in a world that treated purity as weakness was already hard enough, but to love a man like Wellington, the very embodiment of everything she had been taught to avoid, turned her faith into a daily battlefield. Yet it was that same faith that now sustained her. After weeks of distance, silence, and prayer, she returned to church with a new posture. No longer the timid girl waiting to be protected by others. She was now a woman of strong spirit, determined to walk her path with God. And if Wellington still loved her, he would have to love her this way, firm, convicted, and under her new terms. That Sunday service was packed. It was communion day. Patrícia entered wearing the white dress she reserved for sacred occasions. She walked slowly between the pews, eyes fixed ahead. As her feet touched the altar steps, the murmurs ceased. It felt like an apparition. Her mother wept from the middle row. Her father lowered his gaze, overcome by an emotion he hadn't felt in years. And Wellington froze. He stood at the back of the church, sweaty palms, and a soul in ecstasy. She had come back, but what he didn't know was that she hadn't returned the same. After the service, she approached the pastor, requested a formal conversation with Wellington, just the two of them, with the pastor as witness. They went into the small counseling room with thin walls and wooden chairs. Patrícia sat in front of him. No smile, no tears, only firmness. Wellington tried to speak first, but she interrupted. "I need you to listen to me now." And he did, in silence, eyes locked on hers, like a man hearing his fate being read aloud. "I love you, Wellington. But I don't want to be loved by a man who only changed for me. I want to be loved by a man who loves God more than he loves me. Because if your heart clings to me before it clings to him, one day you'll blame me for the things you gave up. And I don't want to be your excuse. I want to be your blessing, not your burden." Those words cut deeper than any rejection he'd ever known, but they also healed, because they were true. They were light. Wellington took a deep breath. "I didn't change because of you, Patrícia. I changed because God used you to show me who I was. You're not the reason for my transformation. You are the fruit of my redemption." She held back tears, wanted to hug him, wanted to shout that she loved him, but she stayed firm. "Then prove it to me, not with gifts, not with promises. Prove it with fruit. Show me that you love God with actions, with patience, with consistency." From that day on, Patrícia imposed silence between them. No messages, no private meetings, no affectionate words, just coexistence within the body of the church as siblings in faith. It would be a time of purification, a season of waiting. She needed to see if he would endure, if he would keep showing up to church, not knowing whether she would ever let him touch her again. And he accepted, without complaint, without trying to rush anything, because now he understood. Real love doesn't beg, it waits, it perseveres, it grows in silence. Weeks passed, and Wellington remained, kept serving, cleaning, praying, fasting. His posture wasn't one of someone trying to impress. It was that of someone who had been transformed, and the entire church began to notice. The pastor invited him to share a short testimony during a youth service. His words moved hearts. Parents who had once been rigid began to shift their views. Even Patricia's father approached him after the service. He didn't apologize, but said, "You're different. Stay that way." For Wellington, it felt like a blessing unspoken. Patrícia saw it all, quietly, but attentively. And every act of his was another brick in a castle she was beginning to believe she could one day live in. One night, after a prayer service, she left the church later than usual. Wellington waited near the gate, holding a Bible marked with a red ribbon. She walked over, hesitantly. He opened the Bible and read, Song of Songs, chapter 2, verse 16. "My beloved is mine, and I am his." Then he closed the book, looked her in the eyes and said, "When the right time comes, I want to call you mine, but only when God says I can." She didn't answer with words, just nodded, eyes glassy, because she knew the harvest time was near, and that love, born in tears, was now blossoming through fruit. On that Sunday, when everything seemed ordinary, the sky was clear, the choir rehearsed the same hymns, and the church slowly filled as usual. No one imagined that Wellington's heart was pounding like never before. He was about to do the impossible, kneel down not to seduce, not to beg, but to consecrate. The man who had once been the symbol of arrogance, pleasure, and dominance now trembled with nervousness, a small velvet box hidden in the inside pocket of his blazer. He had rehearsed his words dozens of times, yet his mind was blank, but his heart was full of a sacred certainty. He wanted her forever, but only with God's blessing and that of the church. Patrícia arrived unaware of everything. She wore her favorite blue dress, hair tied in a simple bun, the Bible pressed tightly to her chest. Her gaze was calm, but bore the marks of someone who had walked through emotional fire and survived. Her steps carried the grace of one who had waited for the right time. Her mother walked beside her in silence, but for the first time, without tension. Her father greeted the brothers with a restrained smile. The atmosphere felt different. Something hung in the air, like a spiritual breeze touching every corner of the sanctuary. The service began. The pastor led the praise with enthusiasm. Then he opened the Bible to Genesis chapter 2 and read, "It is not good for the man to be alone. I will make a helper suitable for him." Patrícia felt her heart speed up. Wellington was seated beside the pastor, which was unusual, but she tried not to jump to conclusions. When the sermon ended, the pastor paused for a long moment, as if waiting for a signal. Then, with a subtle gesture, he gave the floor to Wellington. The sanctuary fell into a glassy silence. Every eye focused on that tall man with an imposing presence, now visibly emotional. He took the microphone with trembling hands. "Brothers and sisters, for months I have been transformed by God in this place. I came here broken, lost, filthy, but I found light, I found direction, I found salvation, and I found love." A soft murmur moved through the pews. Patrícia felt the air leave her lungs. "Patrícia," he said, looking straight at her, voice cracking. "You were the instrument God used to rebuild me. I am not perfect. I am not pure like you, but I am yours, with a cleansed soul, a surrendered heart, a consecrated body." He then pulled the small box from his pocket and stepped down from the altar, walking toward her. The whole church stood. The choir fell silent. The pastor stepped down as well, in reverence. Patrícia covered her mouth with her hands. Her heart raced, and when Wellington knelt before her, tears streamed from his eyes. He opened the box, revealing a simple ring with a soft glow, surrounded by a promise worth more than gold. "Will you be my wife, my helper, my partner, my living prayer? Not as a trophy, not as a prize, But as my blessing sent from heaven, the church erupted in emotion. Some sisters cried even before the answer came. Patricia's father pressed a handkerchief to his eyes. Her mother sighed, hands clasped to her chest. And Patricia fell to her knees before him. I accept, but only if you promise that before me, you will always choose God. Wellington smiled through tears. That is already my choice. And there, kneeling on the wooden floor of that humble church, they sealed an engagement that was no spectacle. It was a miracle. The pastor prayed over them. The whole congregation joined in a chorus of intercession. It was a service unlike any other. People who had never cried before knelt in tears. Young people who no longer believed in love renewed their hope. And Patricia and Wellington, side by side, saw that what had once been born in prejudice, limitations, and struggle, now blossomed under the approval of heaven. There was an aura of holiness and expectation surrounding that engagement. Patricia and Wellington walked together through the church, hands intertwined, exchanging glances full of meaning, whispering promises between psalms. They barely touched beyond what was necessary, respecting physical boundaries with reverence. Even hugs were brief, sealed with prayers and closed eyes. The purity of their commitment was celebrated as a living testimony. The congregation saw them as an example. The youth admired them. And the elders, even Patricia's parents, now silenced their resistance in the face of a visible miracle. But just as everything seemed to move toward final victory, an unforeseen stumble shook everyone's faith. Patricia began to fall ill. At first, it was just isolated dizziness. Then came the morning sickness, pale skin, dry lips, constant nausea. The church sisters began to notice. The more experienced ones exchanged silent glances. Patricia's mother, always watchful, grew suspicious. Patricia, ashamed, tried to hide it. She thought it was nerves, anxiety, emotional exhaustion. But the whispers grew. She's showing the symptoms, they murmured. Did they already sin? The news spread like a plague, and just one visit to the local clinic, suggested by a friend, was enough to ignite chaos. The test result came back with the possibility of pregnancy. Patricia collapsed. She returned home in tears, test papers in hand. Her mother, upon learning the result, screamed, "You stained our name, lied to God, gave away what was sacred before the right time." Her father slammed the door and left without a word. Wellington was urgently called. He arrived at her house with his heart racing. She could barely look at him. "I swear, I never let you touch me, Wellington. Never. You know that." And he, though shaken, held her hand. "I believe you, and if we must, we'll face this together." But his words couldn't stop the scandal. The church went into convulsions. Some members demanded she leave the choir. Others wanted the wedding postponed. The pastor tried to protect her, but even he faced pressure. They must set an example, they said. If they sinned, let them confess. And neither had sinned. Patricia kept her purity. Wellington kept his commitment. But the test, incomplete, inconclusive, was enough for others' faith to turn into judgment. The next day, Patricia fell ill again and was taken to a larger hospital in a nearby city. She underwent a series of tests, and then the truth came. It wasn't a pregnancy. It was an ovarian cyst, benign, but one that altered her hormones. It caused all the symptoms, but without creating life. It was, in biblical language, a test, a valley, a desert. And in light of that revelation, silence fell upon all who had condemned her without knowing the truth. When Wellington heard the diagnosis, he knelt beside her bed, holding her cold hand. "You are the holiest woman I've ever met, and I honor you, not because I have to, but because you deserve it. And if this was our final test before the altar, then God trusted us." She cried, not because of the physical pain, but because she saw in that man, once again, the servant she had chosen to love. Not the dominator, not the conqueror, but the man who was now stronger for knowing how to kneel. The following week, Patricia returned to church, silently, without needing to explain. The pastor stepped up to the pulpit and on behalf of the leadership, publicly asked for forgiveness. "We judged before loving, and we forgot that even Mary was judged for carrying a promise in her womb. Patricia is not pregnant, but even if she were, she would still be worthy of God's love." The church rose in applause. Many cried. Patricia's mother embraced her tightly. Her father, still reserved, kissed her forehead with tears in his eyes. And then, the wedding date was confirmed. With more strength, with more faith, with more truth, the day dawned differently. It was as if the sky already knew what was about to happen. The clouds, which for days had threatened rain, opened in soft golden tones, allowing the light to touch the humble neighborhood houses like a blessing in the form of sunlight. The city woke up lighter. The streets near the church had been swept with extra care. The church sisters arrived early, each bringing flowers from their own backyard, improvised ribbons, hand-starched white cloths. There was no buffet, no magazine photographer, no luxury cars, but there was glory, there was holiness. There was a wooden altar that had never seen such spiritual preparation. Patrícia and Wellington were getting married, and everything around them seemed to bow in reverence. Patrícia was getting ready at her aunt's house. She wore a simple white dress, without sparkles, but adorned with lace sewn by loving hands. The veil had been donated by a church sister who had long dreamed of seeing her walk to the altar in purity. Her hair was delicately braided, no exaggerated makeup, just a glow in her eyes, fueled by tears of someone who had waited faithfully. She trembled, not with fear, but with reverence, because now, after everything, she knew she was marrying a man shaped by God's hands, not the Wellington from the past, but the new one. And this new man was her promise. Elsewhere, Wellington adjusted his suit in front of a cracked mirror. The suit had been borrowed, the tie, a gift from the pastor. His eyes were filled with tears. He had rehearsed this moment so many times that now, standing before reality, he felt small. But that was the sign, to feel small before what is sacred. He took a deep breath, grabbed his Bible, and walked to the church with slow steps. When he arrived, the church was already full. Everyone wanted to witness. Some members had traveled far. Other congregations sent their prayers. The story of that couple was already known, and now it would be sealed before heaven. The ceremony began with worship songs. There was no choir, but the church's voices sounded like angels in unison. The pastor stepped up to the pulpit and spoke like an emotional father. Today, before God and men, we celebrate not only a union, but a testimony that true love waits, that faith prevails, that purity is still possible. Patrícia entered through the main door accompanied by her father, walking with eyes full of tears. When Wellington saw her, he lost his breath. She looked like a living prayer. The entire altar stood in awe. Then came the moment of the vows. Wellington held Patrícia's small, firm hands and began to speak with a trembling voice. "I promise to honor you, not only when it's easy, but when it's hard. I promise to listen to your soul before touching your body. I promise to remember that you are God's daughter before being my wife. And if I ever forget, may the Lord correct me." Patrícia could barely breathe. Her voice faltered, but her faith did not. "I promise to be your companion, even when the world tries to tear us apart. I promise to pray for you when you can't pray. I promise that your calling will be mine too, and that our home will always be an altar." At the end, the pastor raised his hands over them and proclaimed, "I now declare you husband and wife, not by human strength, but by the will of God. What he has joined, let no man separate." The church stood and applauded. Some cried openly, others knelt. It felt like everyone was part of that story, and in truth, they were, because Patrícia and Wellington had endured it all before human eyes, but were sustained by divine hands. As they left, there was no rice throne, no decorated luxury car, just sincere embraces, spontaneous praise, and the certainty that something eternal had begun. They walked out hand in hand, slowly down the sidewalk, like two grateful servants. And when they got home, now their home, Wellington knelt beside Patrícia. Their first night did not begin with kisses or caresses. It began with prayer, with gratitude, and with the commitment that, above all, they would always be children of the Most High. The marriage of Patrícia and Wellington was only the beginning of a harvest that heaven had been preparing in silence. In their first days as husband and wife, the small home they built together overflowed with simplicity, but also with grace. The house was modest, with donated furniture from church members, Bible verses hanging on the walls, and the Bible always open on the table. But it wasn't the appearance that impressed. It was the atmosphere. Inside, there was peace. There was prayer. There was a burning flame that neither time, nor struggles, nor the past could ever extinguish. It was the presence of God hovering like fresh oil over a couple that had chosen to love with sacrifice, walk with purpose, and serve with surrender. Wellington, now completely transformed, was no longer remembered as the arrogant businessman, but as a humble servant. His name no longer appeared in society columns, but in prayer requests. And that was exactly how he wanted to be remembered. He decided to sell his last luxury property, a multi-million-dollar penthouse with an ocean view, and invested every cent into what now beat in his heart, a Christian shelter for abandoned girls. The idea was born during a night of prayer, when Patrícia, kneeling beside him, said through tears, "I wish every girl who feels dirty could know she's still called a daughter." The following month, they bought a modest piece of land on the outskirts of the city. The church mobilized. Members helped with construction. Newly converted businessmen donated materials, and young volunteers came to paint walls and assemble furniture. The place was named Casa Recomeço, the Restart House, a space of refuge for young women who had been rejected by their families, abused, humiliated, or had simply lost faith in themselves. The mission was clear: restore identity, heal wounds, and present the love of Christ. Patrícia led the internal services at the house with fervor. She prayed with the girls, sang hymns with them, and helped teach the word in accessible language. Wellington handled administration, but was never spiritually absent. He cleaned the kitchen, fixed doors, took the girls to medical appointments, and all saw him as an older brother. Firm but loving, the man once seen as a symbol of desire was now a reference of dignity. His masculinity wasn't erased, but redeemed. Now, it served a purpose. His strong body, which once seduced, now protected. Casa Recomeço quickly became a reference. Other churches wanted to model their projects after it. News articles began to appear. A local TV station wanted to do a feature. Wellington declined. "This story belongs to God. It's not a showcase. It's an altar." Patrícia agreed. They didn't seek human recognition. They wanted eternal fruit, and the fruit began to blossom. Girls who arrived hopeless began to sing. Others returned to school. Some in time also found love. But the greatest miracle was seeing their eyes shine again. In church, Patrícia became a role model among the women, but she never lost her essence. She remained simple, remained tender. Only now she walked with greater conviction. The young women of the congregation sought her for advice, and many mothers who were once strict now told their daughters, "Learn from Patrícia." She waited, and God honored her. Meanwhile, Wellington was invited to speak at men's gatherings. And even though he wasn't a preacher, his words struck deep. A man's greatest strength isn't in his muscles or his bank account. It's in his ability to kneel. And so, the couple who were once judged, rejected, and tested became a shining beacon in the darkness. And it all began with a glance inside a small church, a glance that God used to spark a silent revolution. Because true love doesn't shout, it builds. Time passed the way it does in stories that are truly worth telling, without haste, but with purpose. Days turned into seasons, seasons turned into years, and what once began as a scandal walked as a battle and nearly died suffocated by judgment and sacrifice, bloomed into an eternal testimony. Patrícia and Wellington now lived in fullness, not a fullness based on comfort, status, or fame, but one built day after day with faith, commitment, and presence. Their love, once doubted, had become a mighty tree whose branches touched other lives and whose roots could withstand any storm the world might bring. Casa Recomeço grew. New wings were opened. Patrícia led small discipleship groups with the residents. Wellington launched free vocational courses for the girls. Many young people who once doubted true love began attending church. Couples were restored. Families were reunited. The pastor, now an old man, looked at them as if he were seeing the fulfillment of everything he had ever preached. That when God enters a story, not even the most rotten past or the fiercest resistance can stop the harvest. One Saturday afternoon, during the church's anniversary service, the pastor called Wellington and Patrícia to the altar. It was the 5-year anniversary of Casa Recomeço and the 10th anniversary of the church. But no one expected what was about to happen. The pastor looked at the congregation, moved, and said, "If anyone here still doubts that God transforms, just look at them." Patrícia held Wellington's hand. He took a deep breath and picked up the microphone. "I'm not standing here as a victor. I'm standing here as a survivor. I survived pride. I survived lust. I survived unbelief. And all of that because God used a kneeling woman to lift me up." The temple filled with tears. Patrícia, her voice trembling, spoke next. "They said I was naive, that I was weak, that I would be destroyed by this love. But the kind of love that destroys does not come from God. True love builds. It waits, it transforms, and it triumphs." The entire church erupted in applause. Many fell to their knees. Others embraced each other. Even Patrícia's parents, once hardened and unyielding, stood crying, arms raised, recognizing that the daughter they had raised to serve God had become a pillar on that altar. A young member of the congregation recorded the moment on video. It went viral on social media. Thousands of people watched the couple's testimony. People from all over the world began sending messages asking for advice, prayers, saying they had come to believe again in love, in purity, in the possibility of a fresh start. Patrícia and Wellington never sought fame, but now God was making them a reference. One night, lying side by side, after praying together, Wellington stroked Patrícia's hair and whispered, "Do you remember our first glance in that church?" She smiled, eyes closed. "I do. I remember feeling afraid, but I also felt peace." He kissed her forehead tenderly. "I felt like heaven was giving me a chance. And today, every time I look at you, I know I'm still the most blessed man ever to walk this earth." She turned to him, wrapped him in her arms, and replied in a soft voice, "You are the answer to the prayer I made as a girl, when I asked God for a love that would be more than passion, that would be purpose." And there, in the silence of their consecrated home, there was no more doubt, no more pain or fear, only the certainty that their love was greater than any shadow, because it had endured everything, survived everything, and in the end, conquered everything. Pride had fallen. Prejudice was silenced. The world watched, and love won.